June still want you around us.
The hallway was almost dark. Just one lamp on, somewhere in the next room, throwing soft amber light across the wooden floor and the edge of a half-open door. And behind that door a small boy was breathing slow and even in his sleep. She stood with her coat still on. She had not taken it off because she had not yet decided whether she was staying. He stood 2 feet away from her and he was looking at the wall, not at her. He was a man who looked people in the eye when he wanted to end conversations, and he was a man who looked at walls when he was trying to keep himself from saying something he had carried too long in silence. The whole flat smelled faintly of ginger tea, and rain, and the kind of quiet that settles into a house only after something terrible has finished happening in it. She watched the muscle in his jaw move once. She watched his thumb press, slow and careful, against the side of his index finger. And then he spoke, and his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. He said, "I do not know how to ask you to stay." He said, "I have not asked anyone for anything in 2 years." He said, "I do not believe I have the right." She did not answer. She let the words settle in the air between them, because she understood, in a way she had not understood until this exact moment, that he was not making a speech. He was confessing the shape of a wound she had spent 6 weeks tracing without naming, and he was confessing it now because he had nothing left to lose. She took 2 steps toward him. She lifted her hand, and she turned his face toward hers, slowly, with the care of a woman handling something that had been broken once and put back together very carefully by hand. His eyes finally met hers. She said, "Then ask me anyway." "Welcome, my love. You have just walked into the Afro-Korean Love Stories vault, the place where the stories are quiet enough to break you, and tender enough to put you back together by the end of the same hour. If this is your first time here, take a moment, tap the subscribe button, and stay close. Because the story I am about to tell you is the kind that finds the soft place behind your ribs and does not let go until the very last word. Before that hallway, before that question, before this woman ever stood in this man's home with her coat still on, she was sitting alone on a bench in a London park, holding a letter she could not finish reading. 3 weeks before that hallway, on a grey Wednesday afternoon in central London, Naya Asante walked out of a glass building on Bishopsgate with a brown envelope in her hand and a kind of stillness in her chest that she had not felt in 18 months. She had not cried in the meeting. She had not cried in the lift on the way down. She had not cried in the lobby, where the security guard, who had known her name for 4 years, had looked at the envelope and looked at her face and had not said anything, because there are some moments in a person's life when even kindness is too loud. She had walked out onto the pavement, and she had stood for a long moment in the cold, and she had realized that she did not know where she was going. Home was a small flat in Peckham that she shared with her oldest friend, a woman named Adwoa who would take one look at her face and know, and Naya was not yet ready to be known. Her mother was 3,000 miles away in Accra, and her mother did not raise her to call home with bad news. Her mother raised her to call home with solutions, and she did not have one yet. So she did not go home. She took the bus to a small park near Liverpool Street that she had walked past 100 times and had never actually stopped in, and she sat on a wooden bench under a bare branch tree, and she opened the envelope. She read the first paragraph. She read the second paragraph. She did not read the third. She folded the letter in half and then in half again, and she pressed it flat against her thigh with the heel of her hand, and she looked up at the sky and let the cold air pass through her. She was 32 years old. She was Ghanaian British, born in Croydon to a Ghanaian mother who had crossed an ocean with 2 suitcases, and a degree no one in this country had been willing to honor. She had worked since she was 15, with the kind of focus that came from understanding very early that nothing was going to be handed to her. She had built a career in brand strategy that had taken her, by 28, into rooms her mother had only ever cleaned. She had loved one man, for years, and he had told her, 3 weeks before her 32nd birthday, that she was too much, that she had always been too much. She had spent 18 months trying to be less. And today, in a glass conference room on the 8th floor, a man in a blue tie had told her, with the regret arranged neatly on his face, that the company was restructuring, and that her role was no longer required, and that they were grateful for her contributions, and that she would have until the end of the month. She had said thank you. She had walked out. She had not yet figured out how to be angry about it, because she was still busy being surprised. She sat on the bench and she watched a pigeon walk in a slow circle around a discarded crisp packet, and she thought, with the kind of strange clarity that arrives only after a quiet disaster, that she had not eaten lunch. She did not get up. She did not know where she would go. She just sat there, and she watched the park, and she let the cold press itself into the wool of her coat. She came back the next day. She told herself she was looking for a coffee shop, and then she told herself she was just walking, and then she sat down on the same bench and admitted, without saying it out loud, that she was here because the bench was the only place in the city she did not have to perform for anyone. She watched a small boy chase a pigeon. She watched an old man feed a dog a piece of bread from his pocket. She watched a woman in a yellow coat speak rapidly into her phone in a language Naya did not recognize, and she thought, with a softness that surprised her, that she had missed this. She had missed sitting still in public. She had missed watching strangers be alive. She came back the day after that. This time she brought a flask of ginger tea, the way her mother used to make it on cold afternoons in their kitchen in Croydon when Naya was a girl, with fresh ginger and a little honey and a slice of lemon, the kind of tea that warmed your hands through the metal before it warmed your throat, and she sat on the bench and drank it slowly and watched the park. The third afternoon, she saw the boy. She did not see him arrive. She looked up from the flask and he was simply there, standing about 20 feet from her bench, on the wide path that ran along the edge of the small playground. He was small, 6 maybe, Korean, wearing a navy school coat that was a little too big for him, the cuffs falling halfway over his hands, and a small gray backpack on his shoulders. He was holding something carefully against his chest, with both hands like a thing he had been told not to drop. A woman stood about 10 feet behind him, her phone held up at the angle of someone reading something they were not enjoying, and she did not look up. Naya took another sip of her tea. She watched the boy for a moment longer than she meant to, because there was something about the way he was standing that did not match the age of his face. He was standing the way adults stand. Still, watchful, quiet. And then she saw the older boy approach. The older boy was maybe 15. White, tall for his age, in an unzipped hoodie and trainers and the particular kind of bored cruelty that lives in teenage faces when nothing in the world is asking them to be careful. He came up beside the small boy. He stopped. He looked down. And then, with a smile that was not quite a smile, he reached down, slow and deliberate, and he plucked the thing the small boy was holding right out of his hands. It was a rabbit. A small wooden rabbit, hand-carved, missing one ear. The small boy did not move. The older boy held the rabbit up, just above his own head, just out of reach, and he laughed, and he said something Naya could not hear from the bench but could read in the muscle of his jaw, something cruel and light, and he started to walk slowly backward down the path, holding the rabbit higher and higher, like a man dangling a fish he had caught. The small boy did not chase him. The small boy did not cry. The small boy did not move at all. He stood exactly where he had been standing, with his arms still half-curled in front of his chest, in the shape of holding something that was no longer there, and he stared at the rabbit with a face that had gone completely still. Naya looked at the woman with the phone. The woman with the phone did not look up. Naya looked at the man walking his dog 20 feet beyond. The man glanced at the scene. His face flickered in mild discomfort, and he kept walking. She looked at the woman on the next bench who was holding a sandwich and watching openly, the way people watch something on a screen, with the slight detachment of an audience that has agreed in advance not to participate. And Naya understood in one clean second that no one was going to do anything. She set the flask down on the bench. She stood up. She walked across the path. She did not run. She did not raise her voice. She walked across the path the way her mother had taught her to walk into rooms when she was a girl, the way a Ghanaian woman walks when she has decided, before her body has fully arrived, what she is going to do. She stopped between the older boy and the small boy. She did not look at the small boy yet. She looked at the older boy, and she let one full second pass before she said anything. She said quietly, "Give it back." The older boy laughed. He said something that was meant to be funny, something about minding her business, something about how the kid did not even speak English. Naya did not blink. She said, "Give it back, and you are going to give it back to him, not to me." The older boy's smile faltered for the first time. She said, "You are going to put it in his hands the way you took it. You are not going to drop it. You are not going to say anything else. And then you are going to walk down that path, and you are not going to look back at him, and you are not going to do this again." She did not raise her voice once. She did not move her hands. She stood there, full and tall in her camel coat, her afro puff catching the cold afternoon light, her eyes on the older boy's face, and she did not move, and she did not blink, and the older boy looked at her for one more second, and then he looked at the wooden rabbit, and then he looked at the small boy, and then he stepped forward slow, sullen, suddenly 15 again instead of whatever he had been pretending to be a moment ago, and he placed the rabbit, with a kind of clumsy care, into the small boy's still curled hands. He said nothing. He turned. He walked down the path. He did not look back. The woman with the phone finally looked up. Naya did not look at her. She knelt down in front of the small boy, slowly, both knees on the cold path, until her face was level with his, and she let him see her for a long moment before she said anything. His eyes were enormous and very dark. There was a small dampness at the corner of one of them, but he had not let it become a tear yet. He was holding the rabbit with both hands, pressed against his chest, in exactly the shape he had been holding it before. She said, in a voice softer than the one she had used a moment ago, "You were very brave." He did not answer. She said, "You did not chase him. That was the right thing to do. Sometimes the bravest thing is to stand still." He blinked. She said, "What is your rabbit's name?" He looked at her. He looked at the rabbit. His mouth moved, and he said very quietly in careful English, "His name is Toby." She nodded, slowly, as if this was the most important thing she had heard all week. She said, "Toby is a good name." He nodded once. She said, "I think Toby would like to go home now." He nodded again. She stood up, slowly, and she held out her hand, palm up, an invitation, not a demand, and after a long moment, the small boy reached up with his free hand and placed his small cold fingers in hers. She walked him the 10 feet back to the woman with the phone, who was now standing very upright and was apologizing in rapid English with a Korean accent, mortified, half a sentence behind herself. Naya did not blame her. She nodded kindly, and she said only, "He is a lovely boy." The woman gripped the boy's shoulder and said thank you, 3 times, and then said something to him in Korean, sharp and worried, and the boy did not look at her. The boy was looking up at Naya, with a face that had gone soft in a way it had not been soft a minute earlier. Naya bent down one more time. She said, "Take care of Toby." He said, in the same careful quiet English, "What is your name?" She told him. He said, "Naya." He said it the way a child says a word they want to remember. She smiled, gently, and she walked back to her bench, and she picked up her flask, and she sat down and she pretended, for the next 10 minutes, to drink her tea, because her hands were shaking too much to stand up again. She thought that night that it was over. She lay in her bed in the small flat in Peckham, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the quiet weight of a small hand in hers, and she thought with a faint surprise, that for the first time in 18 months she had done something today that she did not regret. It was a small thought. She held on to it. The next afternoon, she went back to the park. She told herself it was because the bench was still the only place in the city where she did not have to perform for anyone, and she told herself it was because she had nothing else to do, and she told herself a third thing she did not bother finishing. She walked through the small gate, and she stopped on the path. The boy was sitting on the grass, cross-legged, in front of her bench. He had the wooden rabbit on his knee. The woman from yesterday was standing about 15 feet away, watching him, clearly anxious, her phone held in her hand but not raised to her face this time. The boy looked up. He saw Naya. He did not smile. His face did not move very much at all. But his shoulders, which had been drawn in tight against his neck, lowered by a fraction, and he watched her walk the rest of the way to the bench with the patience of a child who had been waiting and had decided he was willing to wait longer if necessary. Naya sat down beside him on the grass. She did not sit on the bench. She did not ask him why he was there. She crossed her legs the way he had crossed his, and she set her flask on the grass between them, and she said, "Hello, June." She had learned his name from the woman the day before, who had called him by it as she gripped his shoulder. He said, "Hello, Naya." He pronounced it carefully. She said, "How is Toby today?" He looked down at the rabbit. He turned it in his small hands. He said, "He is okay." She said, "That is good." They sat in silence for a long time. The cold was coming up off the grass through her trousers, and she did not move. After a while, the small boy leaned, very slightly sideways, until his shoulder rested against her arm. He did not look at her. He just leaned. He stayed there, light and careful, the way a child leans against an adult he has decided to trust without yet having decided to admit it. And Naya did not move her arm, did not breathe too deeply, did not do anything to suggest that she had noticed, because she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was a small wild thing that had walked toward her and was choosing to stay close, and the only correct response was to be very still and let it. After about 10 minutes, the woman with the phone walked carefully closer, knelt down on the grass at a respectful distance, and said in soft English, "I am so sorry, miss, he asked to come back. He has been asking since this morning. I tried to take him to the other park and he refused to get out of the car." Naya looked up at her. Naya said, "It is all right." The woman said, "You must think this is very strange." Naya said, "I do not." The woman said, "His father will not be happy." Naya looked down at the boy. The boy was looking at the rabbit. Naya said, I think his father will understand. She did not yet know what kind of man his father was. She would find out the following afternoon. The third afternoon, the woman with the phone was not there. The man standing on the path beside the bench was tall, lean, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had grown into their shoulders rather than built them on purpose. Korean, late 30s, a charcoal suit beneath a long dark wool coat, a crisp white shirt, no tie, no overcoat scarf despite the cold. His hands were in his pockets, but the way he stood made it clear his hands being in his pockets was a choice, not a habit. His face was angular, sharp at the cheekbones, sharp at the jaw, with a thin pale scar running along the right side of the jawline that you would not see unless you were looking for it. His hair was black, immaculately cut, with the faintest threading of silver at the temples that had arrived recently and did not yet feel like his. He was watching her. He was not watching her in the way men in the city sometimes watched her. He was watching her the way a man watches a door that has opened in a wall where he had not known there was a door. Beside him, holding his hand, was June. June was looking at her. June let go of the man's hand. June walked, in the small careful way he walked, across the grass toward her, and he stopped in front of the bench and he did not say anything, and Naya put down her flask and she said, hello. He said, hello, Naya. The man came across the grass and stopped about 4 feet from the bench. He inclined his head, a small precise movement, the way a man bows in countries where men still bow, and he said, in English carefully measured for accent and precision, both, Miss Asante. He had her surname. He had asked for it. He had been told. He said, my name is J. Park. I am June's father. May I sit down? She nodded. He sat down on the bench. He did not sit close to her. He sat at the far end, with one hand still in his coat pocket and the other resting on the wood beside him, and he looked, not at her, but at his son, who had crossed back to the grass and had sat down with the rabbit in his lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, my son does not ask for people. He said it without inflection, the way a man states a fact in a meeting. He said, he has not asked for anyone in 2 years. He said, he is asking for you. Naya did not answer. He said, I would like to make an arrangement with you. He said, 3 afternoons a week, 2 hours each. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Whatever you charge for your professional time, double it. I will have my office draw up a document. It will be clean and it will be respectful and it will protect both of us. She turned her head slowly and she looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his son. She said, no. He turned his head. For the first time, he looked at her directly. His eyes were dark, processing, very still. He said, I am sorry. I assumed you would prefer to formalize. She said, that is not what I am refusing. He waited. She said, whatever your son needs from me, Mr. Park, you cannot buy it. And if it can be bought, then it is not what your son needs. He did not blink. His hand, the one resting on the wood of the bench, moved very slightly. His thumb pressed once, slow and deliberate, against the side of his index finger, and then it stopped. She watched the movement. She did not understand yet what it meant. He said, after a moment, you are right. He said, please forgive me. He stood up. He did not say anything else. He held out his hand to June, and June stood up from the grass, and he took his father's hand, and the two of them began to walk away across the path toward a black car parked at the gate. Halfway across the grass, June stopped. He turned. He looked back at Naya, and his face moved, a small careful motion, almost a smile, almost not, and he said in his quiet English, will you come tomorrow? Naya looked at the boy. She looked at his father, who had stopped, who was waiting, who was not looking at her. She said, yes. She said, I will come tomorrow. She did not go to the park the next day. The car came for her. She had not given him her address. She had not needed to. A black car arrived at her flat in Peckham at 3:15 on Tuesday afternoon, and the driver, a quiet older man in a gray suit, said only, Miss Asante. Mr. Park sends his regards, and held open the door. She got in. The car drove her west, through the slow afternoon traffic, past Westminster, past Knightsbridge, into a part of London she had walked through but had never lived inside, the kind of streets where the houses sat back from the road behind low iron railings and the trees on the pavements were the tallest trees in the city. The car stopped in front of a tall white building with a brass number on the door. The driver said, the 5th floor, Miss Asante. She took the lift. The lift opened directly into the flat. She stepped out. The flat was quiet. It was vast, and it was beautiful, and it was the quietest room she had ever stood inside in central London. Pale wooden floors, cream walls, soft gray furniture. A long window at the far end of the main room that looked out across the rooftops toward the park she could not see but could, somehow, feel. There was no one in the entrance hall. She walked, slowly, into the main room. She heard a small sound from a room beyond. She turned. June was sitting at a wooden table in the kitchen, with a sheet of paper in front of him and a pencil in his small hand. And he looked up, and his whole face changed. It was the first time she had seen him smile properly. He said, "Naya." She said, "Hello, June." She walked into the kitchen. She set her bag down on a chair. She saw on the counter beside the kettle a single white ceramic cup. And inside the cup, 3 thin slices of fresh ginger. She paused. She did not say anything. She lifted the kettle and she boiled the water and she made the tea, and she did not ask whose hand had cut the ginger, and she did not ask why there was only 1 cup. She drank the tea. It was perfect. It tasted exactly like the tea she had made on her bench the first afternoon she had come back. The tea she had not told anyone about. The tea she had sipped slowly while watching a small boy chase a pigeon. She drank it slowly, standing at the counter, while June, behind her at the table, drew a careful pencil drawing of a rabbit with 1 ear missing. She did not hear the front door of the flat open. She did not hear Jay walk through the main room. She felt the change in the air before she heard him, the way you feel a window opening in another room before you understand that the air has shifted. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He had taken off his coat. He was in a charcoal suit, no jacket, just the white shirt with the sleeves rolled once at the wrists, and his face was carefully neutral, and his eyes went, first to his son and then very briefly to her and then back to his son. He said, "June, did you say hello to Miss Asante?" June said in his quiet English, "I did." Jay nodded. He said to her, "May I get you anything?" She held up the cup. She said, "I am all right. Thank you." Their eyes met for 1/2 second. Neither of them looked away. And then he nodded and he stepped back out of the doorway, and she heard him cross the main room, and she heard him close another door softly, and she stood at the counter with the cup of ginger tea warming the inside of her hand, and she understood, somewhere in the back of her chest, in a place she did not yet have language for, that he had cut the ginger himself. The Tuesdays became a rhythm. She arrived at 3:50. The kettle was always boiled by 3:47, the cup always set on the counter, the ginger always sliced. She never asked. He never mentioned it. The housekeeper, an older Korean woman named Mrs. Han who came to the flat in the mornings, had told Naya on the second Tuesday, with a kind of quiet, meaningful smile, that Mr. Park preferred to see to certain things himself. Naya had not asked which things. She had begun, that afternoon, to listen for him in the flat. She heard him, sometimes, in the room down the hall on a phone call, his voice low and Korean and impossible to follow, the rhythms of business. She heard him, sometimes, in the corridor, walking past the open kitchen door without looking in. She heard him once laugh. It was a small sound, not a real laugh, a breath of one. June had said something funny in Korean from the table, and Jay had been standing in the doorway in the soft gray wool jumper that he wore in the flat instead of his suit. And he had laughed just once, and the sound had rearranged the kitchen. Naya had not turned around. She had not trusted her face. She had stood at the sink, and she had washed the same plate twice, and she had listened to the silence that followed his laughter, and she had thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she would do almost anything to hear that sound again. She started, in small ways, to teach June. She had not been hired. She had refused the job. There had been no agreement, no document, no transaction. There was only the kitchen and the cup of tea and the boy at the table. But she sat down beside him, and she watched him write his English worksheets. And when he stumbled, she did not correct him. She asked him to read it again, slowly, until he found it himself. She taught him to look people in the eye for 1 full second before he looked down. She taught him to say no when he meant no. She taught him to ask for what he wanted in a sentence with a verb and a please instead of pointing. He learned quickly. He learned the way children learn when an adult has finally believed them capable. 3 weeks in, on a Tuesday afternoon when the rain was tapping against the long window in the main room and June was tracing the alphabet onto a sheet of paper at the table, Naya was at the counter slicing apples for him into halves, the way he liked them, and Jay walked into the kitchen. He did not greet her. He never did. He moved through doorways the way water moves through stone, quietly, without disturbing anything. He came up beside her at the counter. He reached over her head for a plate from the cupboard above her. As he reached, his forearm brushed the back of her shoulder, the lightest possible contact, the shape of his sleeve through the wool of her jumper, the heat of his skin underneath. Neither of them moved. The contact lasted 3 seconds. Long enough that she felt the breath halt in his chest. Just behind her, the way you feel another person's stillness when they are standing close enough to share air. Long enough that she did not breathe either. Long enough that the knife in her hand stopped moving against the apple. Then he stepped back. He set the plate down on the counter beside her. He said, in his quiet, measured voice, "Thank you for slicing them in halves. He prefers halves." He left the kitchen. She stood at the counter with the knife still in her hand for a long moment, and she did not look at the doorway, and she did not look at June, and she did not move because if she moved she would have to admit to herself what had just happened, and she was not yet ready to. She finished slicing the apple. She arranged the halves on the plate. She walked them with steady hands to the table. She did not look in the doorway when she left the flat that evening. She walked home in the rain. There was a black car at the corner of her street. The driver had the door already open. She had not asked for him. She got in. She did not say thank you because she did not yet know who she was thanking. She rode home in silence. Pause, my love. If you have made it this far with us, you already know what is happening between these two. You are feeling it. The quiet of it. The way she stood at that counter and could not move. The way he did not say a single thing he meant. Pause this video for 1 second, and tap the subscribe button if your heart is doing what I think it is doing. And if there is a sister, a friend, a partner, anyone you know who has lived for stories about love that arrives without permission, send them this video right now. Not for me. For them. For the kind of love that knocks on the door of a woman who has been told she is too much, and waits quietly until she lets it in. Stay close, because what she is about to overhear is the thing that changes everything. It happened on a Tuesday. It happened because she had left her phone in the kitchen and had walked back from the corridor to retrieve it, and because the door to the small study at the end of the hall had been left half open, and because Jay had not heard her footsteps on the wooden floor. He was on the phone. He was speaking Korean. His voice was different. It was not the measured voice he used in the flat. It was not the careful English voice he used with her. It was lower, quieter, with a strain in it that she had not heard before. A man speaking to someone who knew him before he had become careful. She understood later that it was his mother. She did not understand it then. She understood only that he was sitting at his desk, with one hand pressed flat against the surface of it, and his voice was tight, and he was using a word she did not know. He used it 3 times. Yumio, Yumio, Yumio. Each time he said the word, his voice moved against it, the way a man's voice moves against the name of a thing he has been carrying for too long without saying. She stood in the corridor for 1 second longer than she should have. Then she walked away. She did not retrieve her phone. She left without it. That night, in her flat in Peckham, she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she opened her laptop, and she searched the word. It did not mean what she had expected it to mean. She had expected a name. She had thought, somewhere underneath her thinking, that he had been speaking about her. She did not know why she had thought that. She had thought it anyway. It was not a name. It was a noun. The closest English translation in the second result down said, "The act of leaving without explanation, the silence that remains after, the absence that becomes a permanent room in a house." She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a long time. She did not yet know what Sarah had done. She did not yet know about the note on the kitchen counter, the 3 sentences, the 3rd sentence that he had never shown anyone. But she understood, sitting on the edge of her bed in Peckham at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, that the man who had handed her ginger tea every Tuesday afternoon for 6 weeks was a man living inside a room he had never agreed to be locked into, and that every quiet thing he had done for her, the kettle, the cup, the apples, the car at the corner, the brush of his arm against her shoulder, had been the careful, slow movement of a man trying, against the evidence of his own life, to learn how to ask for something again. She put her hand against her mouth in the dark in her bedroom, and she pressed it there for a long time, and she did not let any sound out, because there was no one in the flat to hear it, and because some understandings are too quiet to be made loud. She thought, with a kind of awe she had not felt in many years, that she had been in love with him for weeks. She thought, with a kind of fear she recognized immediately, that she had been in love with him for weeks, and she had not let herself know. She did not sleep that night. She arrived at the flat the next Tuesday at 3:50. The kettle had boiled at 3:47. The cup was on the counter. The ginger was sliced in 3 thin slices. She did not say a word about any of it. She made the tea. She drank it. She did not look at the doorway when he passed it. She had spent 6 weeks pretending not to know. She would spend 2 more pretending the same. And then Sarah came home. The first time Naya saw her, she did not know who she was. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Naya was sitting on the floor of the main room with June, who was building a small tower out of wooden blocks, and the lift had hummed quietly in the entrance hall, and a woman had stepped out, and the woman had stood for a long moment in the open doorway of the main room without saying anything. June looked up. The blocks fell. He did not move. Naya turned her head. The woman in the doorway was Korean, mid-30s, slender, in a long camel coat that was slightly too elegant for an unannounced afternoon visit, with dark hair pulled back into a low knot at the nape of her neck and pearl earrings catching the soft light from the window. Her face was carefully composed. Her smile arrived a half-second too late. She said, in soft, careful English, "You must be Miss Asante." Naya stood up, slowly. The woman walked into the room. She stopped about 6 feet away. She said, "I am Sarah." She said, "I am June's mother." She said, "I have been hearing about you." Naya did not answer immediately. She had spent 6 weeks in this flat, and no one had ever mentioned the word mother to her. Mrs. Han had used the phrase Mr. Park's wife exactly once, in passing, and had said it in the past tense without quite saying so. Jay had never spoken the word at all. June had never used it. And now there was a woman in the doorway, in pearls, with a half-second late smile, and the floor was tilting slightly under Naya's feet in a way she did not want her face to show. She said, "Hello." She said, "I am pleased to meet you." Sarah's smile widened by exactly the right amount. She said, "I have heard that my son has grown very fond of you." Naya said, "He has been very kind to me." Sarah tilted her head. She said, "That is a generous way to describe it." She walked, slowly, across the room. She did not look at June. She walked to the long window and looked out at the rooftops, with her back to both of them, and she said lightly, as if asking about the weather, "How long has this arrangement been in place, exactly?" Naya said, 6 weeks. Sarah said, She did not turn around. She said, "After a long moment, my husband is a man of routines. They protect him." I had not realized how thoroughly he had built a new one. Naya did not answer. Sarah turned. She crossed back across the room, and she stopped in front of June, and she knelt down and she opened her arms and she said, in Korean, something soft and rhythmic, her voice a different woman's voice from the one she had used on Naya. June looked at her. He did not move toward her. His small hand reached, instead, sideways, and he wrapped his fingers around the hem of Naya's trousers. Sarah saw it. She did not let her face change. She said in English, "Oh, Junie, are you shy?" She stood up. She said lightly to Naya, "He will warm to me. He always does. We just need a little time." Naya said, "Of course." Sarah walked toward the doorway. She paused at the threshold. She turned. She said, in a voice so soft it almost sounded affectionate, "You have been a help, Miss Asante. I want you to know I see that. I will speak to my husband about how to thank you properly." She left. The lift hummed down. Naya looked down at June. June was still holding the hem of her trousers. He was looking at the doorway. He was not crying. He had gone, again, to the place she had first found him in. The still place. The frozen place. She knelt down beside him on the floor. She said softly, "June, look at me." He did not look. She said, in the voice she had used on the bench in the park, "Look at me." He looked at her. She said, "You are all right." He nodded very slightly. She said, "Would you like me to read you a story?" He nodded again. She held him for the rest of the afternoon. Not in her arms. Beside her, his shoulder pressed against her arm, the way he had leaned the first time on the grass. When Jay came home that evening, she did not tell him. She did not need to. He walked into the main room, and he saw the way June was sitting against her, and his face did not move, but something behind his eyes did. He said quietly, "She was here." Naya said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry." He said, "I did not know she was coming." She said, "I know." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he said, "May I speak with you in the kitchen?" She followed him. He stood at the counter, one hand pressed flat against the marble, the way she had seen him press his hand against the desk that day in the study, and his thumb moved once against the side of his index finger and stopped. He said, "Sarah has been in Seoul for 2 years." He said, "She has come back." He said, "I do not know yet what she intends." He said, "I will not let her hurt him." She said, "I know." He looked at her. For the first time, he looked at her without looking away. He said, "Will you keep coming?" His voice broke very slightly on the word coming, so slightly that a person who did not know him would not have heard it. She heard it. She said, "Yes." She said, "I will keep coming." He nodded. He did not say anything else. He turned away and he poured himself a glass of water, and he stood at the counter with his back to her and drank it slowly, and she understood that he was standing with his back to her because his face was not, in this moment, a face he wanted her to see. She left the kitchen. She let him have it. Sarah did not leave again. She moved back in. She had a wing of the flat that she had once shared with Jay, and she returned to it with 2 suitcases at first, and then more, and then a small army of beautifully wrapped boxes that arrived over 3 afternoons. She did not move into the room with Jay. She moved into the guest room across the corridor. Jay did not stop her. Naya, on her 3rd Tuesday after Sarah's return, learned from Mrs. Han, in a careful aside in the kitchen while June was in the next room, that Mr. Park and his wife had been formally separated for 19 months, that the divorce papers had been drawn up and were sitting in a drawer in his study, and that they had never been signed because Jay was the kind of man who did not finish things in a hurry. Mrs. Han had said this in a low voice, and she had said it once, and she had not repeated it. Naya had nodded. She had understood that she was being told by a woman who loved this household that the situation was not what it looked like, and that it was also somehow exactly what it looked like. Sarah began to insert herself. She did it with surgical patience. She did not yell. She did not threaten. She rescheduled. The first Tuesday after she moved back in, Naya arrived at 3:50, and the flat was empty. Mrs. Han, apologetic, told her at the door that Madame had taken June to the Natural History Museum, that they had left at 3, that Madame had said she would let Naya know, that Madame had clearly forgotten. Naya said, "That is all right." She turned. She went home. The next Tuesday, June was there, but he was sitting at the table with Sarah beside him, and Sarah was speaking to him in rapid Korean that Naya could not follow, and Sarah looked up when Naya entered and smiled the half-second late smile and said, "Oh, Miss Asante, please do not let us interrupt your tea, we are just finishing." They were not finishing. They sat at the table for the entire 2 hours. June answered in monosyllables. Naya sat in the main room and read a book she was not reading. The Tuesday after that, Sarah was waiting for Naya at the door. She said, with a smile that would have been beautiful on a different woman, "Miss Asante, may I have a word?" She walked Naya into the small drawing room off the entrance hall. She closed the door softly behind them. She turned. She said, "I want you to understand. I am grateful for what you have done for my son." She said, "I am also his mother." She said, "I have been away for reasons that are mine, and I have come back and I am here now and a child needs his mother. You understand this?" She said, "I am not asking you to leave." She said, "I am asking you to consider whether, perhaps, your continued presence is making this transition harder for him." She said, "You would not want to make it harder for him." She said, "Would you?" Naya said, "No." She said, "I would not want to make it harder for him." Sarah said, "Thank you, Miss Asante." She said, "I knew you would understand." She opened the door of the small drawing room. Naya walked out. She had not yet decided what she was going to do. She decided that night. She arrived at the flat the next Tuesday at 3:50. The kettle had boiled at 3:47. The cup was on the counter. The ginger was sliced in 3 thin slices. June was at the table with a worksheet. Sarah, mercifully, was not there. Naya did not make the tea. She walked through the kitchen, past the cup, into the main room, and she stopped in the doorway of the study. Jay was at his desk. He looked up. He saw her face. He stood, slowly. He said, "What is it?" She said, "May I speak with you?" He came around the desk. They walked together back to the kitchen. June was at the table. Naya glanced at him and Jay understood, and he said, in Korean, a quiet sentence, and June looked up and June nodded, and June picked up his worksheet and his pencil and walked, with the wooden rabbit tucked under his arm, into the next room. Naya and Jay stood at the counter. She said, "I am going to step back." He did not answer. She said, "June needs his mother. She is here. She is trying. You are trying. I am not going to be the reason this family does not get its second chance." He said quietly, "Naya." It was the first time he had ever used her first name. He said it the way a man says a word he has been holding in his mouth for 2 months. She did not let it move her. She said, "I will always come if he needs me. He has my number. You have my number. If he is hurt, if he is frightened, if he asks for me, I will come. I will always come." She said, "But I cannot keep coming for tea." She said, "I cannot." He did not argue. He stood at the counter, with one hand pressed flat against the marble, and his thumb moved once, slow and careful, against the side of his index finger and stopped. He looked at the wall. He said, after a long moment, "I understand." She said, "Thank you." She turned. She walked out of the kitchen. She walked through the main room. She passed June, who was sitting on the floor with a rabbit in his lap. She knelt down beside him. She said, "Junie, I have to go." He looked up. He did not understand. She said, "I will see you soon." He said, "You are coming Thursday." She said, "No, my love. Not Thursday." He looked at her. She said, "But if you ever need me, you tell your father, and I will come." He said very quietly, "Will you come?" She said, "Yes. I will always come if you need me." He nodded once. He did not cry. He did the thing he had done in the park the very first day. He went still. She stood up. She walked to the lift. She did not look back at the kitchen. She got in the lift. She rode down to the ground floor. She walked out into the rain. It was the kind of London rain that did not commit to itself, half drizzle, half mist, the kind that soaked through wool by the time you had walked 1 block. She walked. She walked all the way to the corner of Knightsbridge. She did not flag a cab. She wanted to walk. She turned onto her street. It was nearly 7 by the time she reached the corner of her road in Peckham. She had taken the bus the last leg, and her hair was damp, and her coat was heavy with rain, and her feet were aching. She turned the corner. She looked at the curb. There was no car. There had been a car at this corner every rainy night for 6 weeks. It had never been arranged. It had never been spoken about. It had simply been there, every time, the door already open, the driver in the gray suit with his small respectful nod. Tonight there was no car. She stood on the pavement in the rain for a long moment. She could not move. She had not understood, until this exact second, how much of her had grown to expect that car. She stood in the rain, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, and she did not let the sound out, and she stood there until a passing stranger asked her, kindly, if she was all right. She nodded. She said yes. She walked the last 100 meters to her flat. She let herself in. She closed the door behind her. She sat down on the floor of the entrance hall in her wet coat, and she let the sound out. 3 days passed. She did not hear from him. She had not expected to. She had asked him not to make this harder than it needed to be, and he had granted her that, the way he granted everything she asked for, quietly, completely, without comment. She did not go to the park. She got up and she made coffee, and she sat at the small table in the kitchen of her flat, and she revised the redundancy letter she had finally finished reading, and she wrote applications and she answered emails and she performed the shape of a woman moving forward. On the 3rd day, at 11:47 in the morning, her phone rang. The number was unknown. She answered. A voice she had heard exactly twice in 6 weeks, the voice of Mrs. Hahn, broke open on the other end of the line. Mrs. Hahn said, "Miss Asante." Mrs. Hahn said, "Please." Mrs. Hahn said, "Please come." The line went silent. Naya was already standing. She said, "What has happened?" Mrs. Hahn said, "The boy." Mrs. Hahn said, "Please come." The line went dead. Naya did not put on her coat. She did not look for her keys. She left the flat with her phone in her hand and her trainers half-laced, and she ran out into the street, and she stopped a black cab on the main road, and she said, "Faster, please, faster," and the driver heard the thing in her voice and did not ask any questions, and the streets of London moved past the window as if she were watching them through water. She did not breathe properly until the cab stopped in front of the white building. She pressed the lift button. The lift would not come. She took the stairs. 5 flights. She arrived at the flat with her chest burning and her ears ringing, and the front door was open, and she walked in, and she walked through the entrance hall, and she walked into the kitchen. June was on the floor. He was sitting against the cabinet under the kitchen island, with one hand pressed flat against the side of his face, and his eyes were open, and he was not crying, and the wooden rabbit was on the floor a meter away from him on its side, with its one ear pointing up. Sarah was at the counter. Both of her hands were flat on the marble. She was breathing too quickly. Her face had gone the color of her ivory blouse. Mrs. Hahn was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with her own hand pressed to her mouth. Jay was not in the room. Naya did not look at Sarah. She did not look at Mrs. Hahn. She walked across the kitchen, and she knelt on the floor in front of June, and she put one hand very gently on his small wrist, and she lifted it away from his face, and she looked at him. There was a red mark on his cheek where the side of his face had hit the kitchen tile. It was not a bruise yet. It would be by morning. He looked at her. He did not say anything. He had gone to the still place. She said, for sentences. She said, "You were very brave." She said, "You did not chase her." She said, "Sometimes the bravest thing is to stand still." She said, "I am here." He blinked. He lifted both arms. He wrapped them around her neck. He did not let go. She lifted him up off the floor. He was heavier than he looked. He pressed his face into the side of her neck, and he did not cry, but his whole small body shook once, and then went still and stayed still. She turned. She looked at Sarah for the first time. Sarah's composure cracked for 2 full seconds. Naya saw it. Sarah saw that Naya had seen it. The composure returned, harder than before. Sarah said, in a voice that was trying very hard, "It was an accident, Miss Asante. He tripped. He fell against the island." Naya did not answer. Mrs. Han in the doorway said, in a voice Naya had never heard her use, "That is not what I saw." Sarah's face did not move. Behind Naya in the entrance hall, the lift hummed. The doors opened. Jay stepped out of the lift. He walked into the kitchen. He took in the scene in one slow look. His son in Naya's arms. The mark on his son's cheek. Mrs. Han in the doorway. Sarah at the counter with her hands flat on the marble. His face did not move. His thumb did not move against his index finger. He had gone past the place where his small tells lived, into a stillness Naya had not yet seen in him, and which she understood in one instant was the most dangerous thing she had ever stood close to. He said in English so that everyone in the room would understand every syllable. He said, "Sarah." He said, "You are going to leave this flat tonight." He said, "You are not going to come back." He said, "My lawyer will call yours in the morning." Sarah said, "Jay." He said, "Do not." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Sarah looked, for 1 second, at her son in another woman's arms, and the composure broke again, properly this time, and a small terrible sound came out of her, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, and she walked, fast, past Naya, past Mrs. Han into the corridor, and they heard a door close. Mrs. Han quietly followed her. Jay crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of Naya and his son. He looked at June. He put his hand very carefully on the back of his son's small head, and he held it there, and he closed his eyes for 1 full second, and he opened them. He said in Korean something soft to his son. June did not lift his face from Naya's neck. June said in English muffled against her, "I want Naya." Jay said, "I know." Jay said, "She is here." He looked finally at Naya. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She carried June to his bedroom. She sat with him on the small bed. She read to him from a book of folktales that had Korean and English on facing pages, and she read only the English and she made up the Korean from the pictures, and June, for the first time in the entire 6 weeks she had known him, laughed once, a small surprised laugh, into her shoulder. By the time she finished the 3rd story, he was asleep. She stayed for a long time. She watched him breathe. She put the wooden rabbit, which someone had brought up from the kitchen, into his small hand on the pillow, and she closed his fingers around it, and she stood up. She walked out of the bedroom. She closed the door behind her with the soundless precision she had seen Jay use 100 times. She turned. He was in the hallway. The flat was almost dark. Just one lamp on in the next room, throwing soft amber light across the wooden floor. The whole flat smelled faintly of ginger tea, and rain, and the kind of quiet that settles into a house only after something terrible has finished happening in it. She had not taken off her coat. She had not, in the chaos of the afternoon, remembered that she had run out of her flat without one. She was wearing her cardigan, the cream one, and Mrs. Han had, at some point, put a coat over her shoulders. It was Jay's. It was charcoal. It smelled like him. She stood in the hallway with his coat on her shoulders. He stood 2 feet away from her. He was looking at the wall. "We are back. We are exactly where we started." The lamp, the amber light, the half-open door, the small breathing behind it. He was looking at the wall because he was a man who looked at walls when he was trying to keep himself from saying something he had carried too long in silence. She watched the muscle in his jaw move once. She watched his thumb press, slow and careful, against the side of his index finger. And then he spoke, and his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. He said, "I do not know how to ask you to stay." He said, "I have not asked anyone for anything in 2 years." He said, "I do not believe I have the right." She did not answer. She let the words settle in the air between them, because she understood, in a way she had not understood until this exact moment, that he was not making a speech. He was confessing the shape of a wound she had spent 6 weeks tracing without naming, and he was confessing it now because he had nothing left to lose. She took 2 steps toward him. She lifted her hand, and she turned his face toward hers, slowly, with the care of a woman handling something that had been broken once and put back together very carefully by hand. His eyes finally met hers. She said, "Then ask me anyway." He looked at her. He did not look away. He said in a voice that was barely a voice, "Stay." He said, "Please." He said, "Stay." She closed the small distance between them. She did not kiss him. She rested her forehead, slowly, against his. His breath came out all at once, the way a man breathes out a thing he has been holding for 2 years. His hand came up, slowly, and he placed it against the side of her neck, and he held it there, and his thumb moved once, slow and careful, against the line of her jaw and stopped. They stood like that for a long time. The flat was quiet. In the next room, a small boy was breathing slow and even in his sleep. She did not say "I love you." He did not say it either. They were not those people. They had said it already, in every way they knew how, for 6 weeks, in ginger tea and apples sliced in halves and a black car at a corner on a rainy night. She said, against his forehead, quietly, "I am here." He said, against hers, "I know." That was the whole sentence. That was the whole moment. That was the whole love story. Spring in London is small and uncertain. It arrives in fragments. A morning where the light comes in differently. A tree you walk past that has, overnight, decided to be green. A bench in a park that is no longer cold to sit on. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind with a soft yellow sun and a light wind that was not yet warm but was no longer punishing, and Naya was sitting on the bench under the bare branch tree that had finally begun to grow leaves, with 2 paper cups of ginger tea balanced on her knee. In front of her, on the grass, was a small boy. He was bigger than he had been 6 months ago. His hair was a little longer. His shoulders had unrolled from the place they had been carried. He was sitting cross-legged on the grass, and across from him, watching him with enormous eyes, was a smaller child, a girl of about 4, who had wandered over from another bench and had stopped because of the wooden rabbit in his lap. June was teaching her how to hold it. He was speaking in careful, patient English. He was saying, "You have to be very gentle because his ear came off a long time ago, and we do not want to hurt him again." The little girl nodded very seriously. June placed the rabbit in her small hands. She held it against her chest exactly the way he had once held it. She looked up at him. He looked back at her. He held her eyes for 1 full second before he looked down. The way he had taught himself, the way Naya had taught him, and a small careful smile moved across his face, and the little girl smiled back, and her mother, on the bench watching, pressed her hand to her chest without realizing she had done it. A man sat down on the bench beside Naya. He did not say hello. He never did. He took one of the paper cups from her knee, and he held it between his hands, and he leaned back against the bench, and his shoulder pressed lightly against hers, and neither of them moved. He was wearing a soft gray jumper instead of a suit. He did not work on Saturdays anymore. He had stopped working most Saturdays since November. Mrs. Hahn, when Naya had remarked on this once, had given her a small, dry, meaningful smile and had said, with the lightest possible inflection, "Miss Asante, my employer is becoming a different man." Naya had not answered. She had wrapped her hand around her cup of tea and had pretended not to be smiling. On the grass, the little girl handed the wooden rabbit back to June and stood up and ran back to her mother on the next bench, and her mother caught her and laughed, and June watched them go for a moment, and then he looked back at his bench and he saw his father and Naya, and his face did something it had not done 6 months ago. His face opened. The full opening. The trust state. The state Naya had only seen twice before. He stood up. He walked across the grass. He climbed onto the bench between his father and Naya the way a child climbs onto a bench when the bench belongs to him, when the people on the bench belong to him, when he understands with the bone-deep clarity that only children have, that he is exactly where he is meant to be. He leaned, lightly, against Naya's arm. She did not move. She had been waiting for it. Jay's hand, on the bench between them, moved slowly across the wood. He placed it over hers. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. He closed his eyes for 1 full second. When he opened them, he was looking at his son. Naya looked too. June was watching the small girl with the rabbit walk away across the grass with her mother, and his small face was settled and quiet, the way the face of a person settles when something inside them has finished reorganizing itself and is, finally, at rest. She understood, in that moment, what he had recognized in her on the very first day. She understood because the night before, sitting in the kitchen of the flat, Jay had told her, in his careful measured voice, the thing he had been waiting for the right moment to tell her. He had told her about his mother. His mother had died when June was 3. June had only met her twice, on video calls, because she had been ill in Seoul and the family had not yet flown out. On the second of those video calls, his mother had been speaking to her late husband, who was sitting beside her on the bed, and she had used a phrase June had not understood, and she had said it 3 times the way she always said it, the way she had said it for 41 years. She had called him my person. June had heard her say it. He had not known what it meant. He had known only that his grandmother, when she said it, had a kind of light in her face that he had never seen on his own mother's face, and that the man beside her, his grandfather, had looked at her like she was the only person in the world. A year and a half later, on a cold Wednesday afternoon in a London park, when a woman in a camel coat had crossed a path to stand between him and a teenage boy who had taken his rabbit, and she had spoken without raising her voice, and her face had not moved, and the older boy had given the rabbit back, June had looked up at her, and he had felt, in the small, unarticulated language that children have, that he had seen her face before. He had seen it on a video call. He had seen it on his grandmother. He had reached for the only word he knew for it. He had not known what it meant. He had known only that it was the right word. My person. Naya, on the bench in the spring sun, with June leaning against her arm and Jay's hand over hers, looked down at the boy beside her, and she understood that she had not been chosen at random. She had been recognized by a 6-year-old boy holding a one-eared wooden rabbit, on a path in a small park, on a gray afternoon when she had been sitting alone with a redundancy letter she could not finish reading and a small still question in her chest about whether the woman she had been before Daniel was ever coming back. She had been recognized. She had been called by the name his grandmother had used for the only love of her life. And the man beside her now, the man with his hand over hers and his shoulder against her shoulder and his thumb resting still against her knuckles, had spent 6 weeks teaching himself, against every piece of evidence his life had given him, that he was allowed to want her. She lifted her cup of tea. She took a small slow sip. She looked at June. She looked at Jay. She looked at the path where, 6 months ago, she had crossed to a small boy with a wooden rabbit, and had not known that she was crossing into the rest of her life. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She closed her eyes for 1 full second, and she let the spring sun warm her face, and she felt, for the first time in 18 months, that the woman she had been before Daniel had not gone anywhere at all. The woman she had been before Daniel had been waiting on this bench. The woman she had been before Daniel had simply been waiting for the right small hand to reach for hers, and the right quiet man to sit down beside her without saying hello, and the right cup of ginger tea to warm her palms in the cold, and the right name to be called by. My person. She opened her eyes. She turned her hand under Jay's and she laced her fingers through his, and she did not look at him, and she did not need to because he was already looking at her, the way the man on a video call in Seoul had once looked at the woman who had called him hers for 41 years. The path in front of them was empty. The spring sun was soft on the grass. June, between them, leaned more heavily against her arm, and his small hand reached up, slowly, and closed around the cuff of her jumper, and he held it there, the way he had held the hem of her trousers on the day his mother had come home, the way he had held the wooden rabbit on the day a stranger had crossed a path to give it back to him. He had been holding on in his small, careful way since the very first afternoon. He had recognized her. He had not let go. My love, if you have stayed with us all the way to this bench, all the way to this hand on this hand, all the way to this small boy leaning against the cuff of her jumper in the spring sun, then I want to ask you something. Tell us in the comments who this story made you think of. Who is the person you would call your person, the one you recognized before you knew how? Tell us which moment between Naya and Jay stayed with you most. The kettle at 3:47. The cup on the counter. The brush of his arm at the kitchen counter. The car at the corner of her street that was always there until it was not. The hallway. The 2 words she gave him. Ask me anyway. We will read every comment. We will sit with every name you give us. Because that is what this place is for. Stories that find the soft place behind your ribs and stay there. So if this story moved you, subscribe to the Afro-Korean Love Stories Vault and stay close, my love. Because love, the real kind, the kind that survives the silence and the leaving and the coming home, is always, always worth the wait. The boy in the park called me his person on a Tuesday afternoon, and I thought he had made a mistake. He had not. He had recognized me before I had recognized myself. Some loves do not arrive. They are recognized. And when they are, you do not ask twice. You do not need to.